I placed the $10 bottle of whiskey my son sent for my birthday right in the center of the kitchen table. Next to it, I laid the deed to my house. He and his father-in-law, Mr. Peterson, were on their way over, expecting me to sign away the only home I'd ever known, all for one of their business deals. They thought I was just a simple old man, easily swayed by a cheap gift and a hollow promise. They had no idea that I wasn't just signing a document. I was closing a chapter, and they were about to pay the price for every sacrifice they'd forgotten. You're probably wondering how a retired carpenter ended up in a financial standoff with two of the most powerful men in the city. It's a long story, one that started not with anger, but with a quiet, breaking heart. That bottle of whiskey wasn't a thoughtless gift. It was a weapon, and it triggered a response they never saw coming. If you want to hear how it all unfolded, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions about this story in the comments. It all began on the morning of my 65th birthday, in the silence of my empty house. Before that bottle of whiskey landed on my kitchen table like a grenade, my days had a rhythm, a quiet predictability that I cherished. My mornings always started the same way. The sun would filter through the old lace curtains in my bedroom, the ones Eleanor picked out back in '78, and I'd lie there for a moment, listening to the house settle. It's a different kind of silence when you're alone. It's heavier. I'd make my way to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under my weight in the same familiar spots, and put on a pot of coffee. The rich, dark smell was the first thing that truly woke me up, a small comfort that never changed. I'd sit in the worn armchair by the window, the one with the permanent indent from where Eleanor used to curl up with a book, and watch the neighborhood come to life. My real sanctuary, though, was the workshop out back. It's more than just a shed. It's a library of my life, written in sawdust and sweat. The moment I'd slide open the heavy wooden door, the scent would hit me, a mix of cedar, pine, and the faint metallic tang of machine oil. It's the smell of purpose. For 40 years, I made a living in that space, building furniture that would outlive me. Now, in retirement, I worked for myself, for the joy of it. My current project was a rocking horse for the little girl who just moved in next door. I was carving the mane, each curl a deliberate, patient stroke of the chisel. My hands, thick with calluses and mapped with scars, knew the feel of the wood better than they knew anything else. They weren't the hands of a businessman. They were the hands of a man who built things to last. Every tool hanging on the pegboard wall had a story. The heavy mallet with the hickory handle was a gift from my father when I started my apprenticeship. The set of Japanese chisels, sharp enough to shave with, I bought with the profits from my first big commission back in 1985, a full dining set for the mayor. I'd saved for 6 months to afford them. Eleanor had framed the check for $3.200 and hung it on the wall in here right next to a faded photograph of us on our wedding day. She always said this workshop was where the real magic happened. Sometimes, when the afternoon light slanted just right through the dusty window, I could almost feel her standing behind me, her hand on my shoulder whispering, "That's beautiful, Clark." The memory was so vivid it was almost painful, a ghost of warmth in the cool, quiet air. This house, this workshop, it was all built on a foundation of sacrifice, not the resentful kind, but the kind you make willingly, with a full heart for the people you love. The biggest sacrifice was the timberland my father left me, 80 acres of old-growth pine up on Whisperwind Ridge. I remember taking David there when he was a boy, teaching him how to tell a ponderosa from a lodgepole. He loved the clean, sharp smell of the air, the way the wind sounded sighing through the tops of the trees. It was my legacy, a connection to the past. But when David was accepted into that fancy MBA program, the tuition was astronomical, over $120,000 for the 2 years. He had a dream, a fire in his eyes that reminded me so much of myself at his age. So we sat at this very kitchen table, the same one now holding that cursed bottle, and I made a decision. I signed over the deed to the timberland to his newly formed company for $1. That was the official price on the document dated May 14, 2004. It was a gift, a way to give him the seed capital he needed to secure loans and get started. "I'll make you proud, Dad," he'd said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll pay all this back, 10 times over." I didn't care about the money. I just wanted him to have the life he envisioned. A life bigger than the one I could offer him with sawdust under my fingernails. I believed in him. I saw the land not as a loss, but as an investment in my son's future. the most important thing I could ever build. I never once regretted it. Not until that birthday morning, when the silence of the house began to feel less like peace and more like an accusation. The change in David wasn't a sudden storm. It was a slow, creeping frost. It began about a year after he married Amelia Peterson, a woman who seemed to measure the world in carats and square footage. In the beginning, after I'd given him the timberland, he'd call every Sunday. He'd ask about my projects in the workshop, his voice still full of the boy who loved the smell of sawdust. He'd tell me about his classes, the challenges, the small victories. I felt like I was still a part of his journey. But once he joined his father-in-law's firm, Peterson Capital, the calls became shorter, less frequent. The sawdust was replaced by stock prices. The first real crack appeared the Christmas they moved into their new mansion in the city's most exclusive neighborhood. For 3 months I'd worked on their housewarming gift. I used a piece of black walnut I'd been saving for over 20 years. Wood so rich and dark, it felt like holding solidified night. I crafted a hall table, a simple, elegant piece with hand-cut dovetail joints, and a finish so smooth it felt like silk. I poured 150 hours into it, my hands aching but my heart full. I pictured it in their entryway, the first thing guests would see, a piece of me in their new life. I rented a truck and drove it the 2 hours into the city myself. When I arrived, David met me at the door. He looked different in his tailored suit, his posture stiffer. "Dad, this is amazing," he said, but his eyes were glancing over my shoulder, towards the street. Amelia came out, giving the table a quick, appraising look. "Oh, Clark, it's very rustic." The word hung in the air, cold and sharp. They placed it in the hall for the day, but it looked out of place against their stark white walls and abstract metal sculptures. A month later, during a brief phone call, David mentioned it offhandedly. "We had to move the table you made, Dad." Amelia's designer said it clashed with the minimalist aesthetic. "It's in the upstairs storage room, safe and sound, of course." I didn't say anything. I just looked at my hands, at the calluses earned from shaping that wood, and felt a profound, hollow silence. A piece of my heart was now gathering dust in a storage room. Then came the dinners. Once or twice a year they'd invite me to their sterile, cavernous house for a holiday. I'd sit at their 20-foot dining table, feeling like a misplaced tool from my own workshop. It was at one of these dinners that I properly met Mr. Peterson. He was a man who commanded a room without raising his voice, his eyes constantly calculating. He shook my hand, his grip firm but impersonal, and looked me up and down. "So, you're the carpenter," he said, not as a question, but as a label. "David tells me you're quite the craftsman. A noble profession. Quaint." Later, over a dinner that cost more than my monthly mortgage used to, he turned to me. "Clark, have you ever considered leveraging your assets? That little house of yours must be on a decent plot of land. Real estate is king. You could be sitting on a small fortune instead of a pile of old wood." David just shifted uncomfortably in his seat, saying nothing. I felt like an exhibit in a museum, a relic of a simpler time they found amusing but ultimately irrelevant. The phone calls dwindled to once a month, then to special occasions only. They were no longer conversations, they were updates. David would list his latest acquisitions, the deals he was closing, the quarterly profits. He spoke in a language of liquidity, capital, and leverage. When I tried to tell him about the rocking horse I was making or the old Ford I was restoring, there would be a pause on the other end of the line, a patient silence that felt more dismissive than any interruption. "That's great, Dad. Sounds like you're keeping busy," he'd say, his tone distracted, before quickly changing the subject back to a new commercial property they were eyeing downtown. I stopped trying to share my life with him. It was clear my world, the one built by hand with patience and care, had no currency in his. I was no longer his father. I was a box he had to check off a list, a duty to be performed with minimal effort. And as my 65th birthday approached, I found myself hoping for nothing more than a simple phone call. A few genuine words. I should have known even that was too much to ask. The afternoon light had turned a tired, dusty gold, stretching long shadows across the linoleum floor. I hadn't moved for what felt like hours. The bottle of Black Creek bourbon sat on the table like a silent accusation. It wasn't just whiskey. It was a symbol of my own erasure. Every time my gaze fell on it, I saw Eleanor in her final months, her skin, the color of old parchment, her smile a brave, fragile thing. The acrid smell of cheap grain seemed to emanate from the sealed bottle, a phantom scent mixing with the memory of antiseptic hospital corridors. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a room where something has died. I was just tracing the rim of my cold coffee cup when the telephone's shrill ring sliced through the quiet, making me jump. For a moment I just stared at it, the old rotary phone on the wall. It was a relic, like me. I let it ring a second time, then a third, before my hand moved on its own, lifting the heavy black receiver. "Hello?" I said, my voice raspy from disuse. "Dad?" "It's David." His voice was clipped, hurried. There were no pleasantries, no "Happy birthday," no "How are you?" Just the familiar, brisk tone of a man who has precisely 90 seconds to spare between conference calls. "Listen, I'm glad I caught you. I don't have much time, but I need to ask you for a big favor." I said nothing, just listened to the faint sound of typing in the background. My eyes drifted to the photograph of Eleanor on the mantel, her smile so full of life. "Look," he continued, a note of impatience creeping in. "Mr. Peterson and I are in the final stages of a major real estate acquisition. It's a game changer for the firm. We're talking a 9-figure deal. The thing is, the bank is asking for a bit more liquidity to secure the final loan tranche. It's just a formality, a box-ticking exercise, but we need to show more assets on the books, just for a short period." He paused, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, searching for the right words to make the unthinkable sound reasonable. "We need you to sign the house over to the company as temporary collateral, just for 90 days. Once the deal closes, we'll sign it right back. It's completely risk-free, Dad." Just a piece of paper. My throat went dry. The house. This house, built with my own 2 hands on the land my father gave me. The walls that held the echoes of Eleanor's laughter. The floors where David took his first steps. He was asking for it, like he was asking to borrow a lawnmower. The receiver felt cold and heavy in my hand. I could hear a muffled voice in the background, deeper, more authoritative. It was Mr. Peterson. "David, just get it done," the voice said, distant but clear. "Is he giving you trouble? Did he like the whiskey? Keep the old man happy. We need that signature by Friday." That was it, the trigger. The world seemed to slow down, the hum of the refrigerator fading into a dull roar in my ears. The cheap whiskey wasn't a thoughtless gift. It was a pacifier, a $10 attempt to keep the old man happy, while they prepared to strip me of the last thing I had. They didn't see a father, a man who had sacrificed his own legacy for his son's future. They saw a name on a deed, an asset, a tool to be leveraged and then put away. My grief didn't turn into fire. It turned into ice. A cold, clear, unshakable certainty settled in my chest, pushing out all the hurt and leaving only a profound, crystalline calm. The vulnerable old man who had been mourning his own irrelevance all day was gone. In his place stood someone else, someone they had never met. I took a slow, steady breath. "Of course, son," I said, my voice perfectly level, betraying nothing of the storm that had just broken and passed inside me. "I understand. Business is business." There was a palpable sigh of relief on the other end of the line. "Great. That's great, Dad. I knew you'd understand. I'll have the papers couriered over, right?" "No," I interrupted, my tone polite but firm. "Don't send a courier. This is a family matter. Why don't you and Mr. Peterson come over tomorrow morning? Say 10 o'clock? We can sign everything then, in person." I let a small pause hang in the air before adding the final touch. "I'll even open that bottle you sent. We should toast to your new venture." "Oh, okay." "Yeah, that works," David said, slightly thrown off but pleased. "We'll be there. See you at 10. I hung up the phone, placing the receiver gently back in its cradle. My hand wasn't shaking. I walked over to the old oak desk in the corner, the first piece of furniture I ever built. I pulled out the deed to the house and laid it on the polished surface. Then, from the bottom drawer, I retrieved another file. It was thin, the papers inside yellowed with age. I opened it and took out the document dated May 14, 2004, the official sales contract for the 80 acres of Whisperwind Ridge timberland. Sold to David's newly formed company for the grand total of $1. A gift. I placed it right next to the deed. They were coming for a signature. They were about to get an education. As I placed the receiver back on its hook, the click echoed in the profound silence of the kitchen. There was no surge of adrenaline, no tremor in my hands. The hurt that had been a dull ache in my chest all day had receded, replaced by a strange and absolute stillness. It was the kind of quiet that settles over a workshop after the final cut has been made and the sawdust has begun to drift to the floor. The work is not yet finished, but the most important measurement has been taken, the line has been drawn, and the path forward is perfectly, irrevocably clear. They thought they were dealing with a sentimental old fool. They were about to learn that a man who has spent 40 years measuring twice to cut once doesn't make mistakes when the stakes are this high. I walked slowly, deliberately, not to the living room to sink into a chair, but to the old roll-top desk in the corner. My fingers, steady and sure, found the small brass key. Inside, beneath years of paid bills and old tax returns, was a thick manila envelope labeled House. I pulled out the deed. Its paper crisp and official. I laid it on the kitchen table, directly in the path of a sunbeam, making the embossed seal gleam. This was the prize they were after. Then I reached deeper into the drawer, to a place I hadn't looked in years. My hand closed around a much thinner, flimsier file. The paper inside was brittle, yellowed at the edges, folded into a neat square. I carefully unfolded it. The typewritten letters were faded but legible. Agreement of sale, May 14, 2004. The property, 80 acres of timber on Whisperwind Ridge. The buyer, David Clark, CEO of Clark Holdings, LLC. The sale price, $1. A ghost of a smile touched my lips. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the grim, satisfied expression of a craftsman finding the perfect, overlooked tool for a difficult job. They had forgotten about this document. In their world of nine-figure deals and complex leveraging, a $1 transaction from nearly 2 decades ago was less than a rounding error. To them, it was ancient history. To me, it was the foundation. I placed the old, fragile contract right next to the new, crisp deed. They were 2 parts of the same story, a story they had only read the last chapter of. They would not see this coming. They had built their empire on a foundation I had given them for nothing, and now they wanted to take the roof from over my head to build it even higher. But they had forgotten one crucial thing about foundations. If the first stone is not respected, the entire structure is vulnerable. Tomorrow morning, I wasn't going to raise my voice. I wasn't going to plead or accuse. I was simply going to present them with the bill. That night, I didn't sleep. But I didn't toss and turn either. I lay in the quiet darkness of my bedroom, the same room where Eleanor had taken her last breath, and I felt a profound sense of purpose. The grief was still there, a heavy blanket in the corner of the room, but it no longer smothered me. Instead, it was a quiet observer to the birth of a cold, hard resolve. When the first hint of gray dawn touched the lace curtains, I was already up. I didn't linger. I went to the kitchen and made the coffee. But this morning the ritual was different. It wasn't a comfort. It was fuel. The rich, dark liquid was a promise I was making to myself. As I drank, I looked at the 2 documents on the table, side by side under the pale morning light. One represented my future, the other, my son's past. My first call was at 8 a.m. sharp, as soon as the office opened. I dialed a number I hadn't used in over a decade, a number written in my old address book in Eleanor's neat cursive. Miller & Sons, attorneys at law. Robert Miller answered on the second ring. His father had been my friend, a man who believed a handshake was a binding contract. I hoped the son had inherited some of that old-world integrity. I explained the situation to him, my voice even and measured. I told him about the timberland, the $1 sale on May 14, 2004, and the current demand for my house as collateral. I didn't add any emotion. I just stated the facts, like I was reading a blueprint. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Mr. Clark," Robert finally said, his voice a low hum of professional curiosity, "this is quite a situation. The $1 sale, was it documented as a gift on your tax returns for that year?" My heart gave a small, steady thump. "Yes," I said. "I paid a tax preparer $250 to file a Form 709. The gift tax return. I wanted everything done by the book." I could almost hear him smile. "That is very, very good news," he said. "That single document solidifies your position immensely. It proves intent. The land wasn't a sale, it was a gift with a nominal fee to make the contract binding. A gift valued at the time at approximately $450,000. Mr. Peterson is a shark, Clark. He operates on leverage and assumed value. I highly doubt he knows the seed capital for his son-in-law's empire was a gift from a carpenter. He sees the land as a corporate asset, not a family sacrifice. He gave me clear instructions. Make notarized copies of that 2004 contract and the gift tax form. I can do that for you right now if you can get here. Cost you about $50. And Clark? When they arrive, just listen. Let them talk. The more they talk, the better it is for you." An hour later, I was back from Robert's office, a crisp new envelope in my hand containing the notarized copies. The originals were now safely locked in his office fireproof safe. Back at my desk, I continued my quiet excavation of the past. I pulled out a dusty box labeled Finances 2004. My hands, usually steady with a chisel, felt clumsy with the brittle paper. But I found it. A bank statement from June 2004. And there it was. A single line item that made my breath catch. A deposit dated June 1st, 2004 for the amount of $1. The memo line read, Clark Holdings LLC Land ACQ. I carefully placed the statement with the other documents. It was a small, insignificant number, a single dollar, but it was the cornerstone of my son's entire career, and he had forgotten it even existed. With 90 minutes to go before their 10 o'clock arrival, I began to prepare the stage. I cleared everything off the kitchen table, the one I built from a single slab of oak 40 years ago. I polished its surface until the wood grain shone like a deep, flowing river. I went to the china cabinet, a piece I made for Eleanor as a wedding anniversary gift, and took out 3 glasses. 2 were heavy, intricately cut crystal tumblers, part of a set we'd received on our wedding day. We only ever used them for special occasions. The third was a plain, cheap water glass from a set I'd bought at a discount store after she was gone. I set the 2 crystal glasses on one side of the table. I placed the cheap glass on my side. In the absolute center, I placed the $10 bottle of Black Creek bourbon. It looked like a cheap monument on a grand altar. Finally, I took the manila folder containing the notarized copies and the bank statement, and placed it squarely in front of my chair. The deed to the house, the prize they were coming for, I left on the desk in the corner, out of sight. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick marking a second closer to the confrontation. I walked to the window and looked out at my workshop. Through the dusty glass, I could see the unfinished rocking horse on my workbench, its wooden form waiting patiently for a final touch. I had built my life on creating things of permanence, things of beauty and function. My son and his father-in-law built their lives on transactions, on numbers that shifted on a screen. They saw my house as just another number, another asset to be leveraged. They had no idea that they weren't walking into a business meeting. They were walking into a museum of a life they had long ago discarded, and I was the curator, and I was about to give them a tour they would never forget. Right on cue, I heard the low, predatory growl of a high-end German engine pulling into my gravel driveway. The clock began to chime 10. The doorbell rang, a sharp, impatient sound. I took one last slow breath, my hand resting for a moment on the back of Eleanor's empty armchair. Then I walked to the door and opened it. The heavy silence that followed the slam of my front door was different from the lonely quiet that had preceded it. It was clean, purged. The air in the kitchen, once thick with tension and unspoken history, now felt light, clear. I looked at the table. The 2 crystal tumblers sat untouched. My cheap water glass was empty. And in the center, the bottle of Black Creek bourbon stood like a defeated king on a battlefield. I picked it up, not with anger, but with a strange detachment. I walked to the kitchen sink, twisted the cap, and poured every last drop of the amber liquid down the drain. The gurgling sound was the only reply. The acrid smell filled the room for a moment, a final, ghosting insult, before I rinsed it away with cold, clean water. The battle wasn't over, it had just been declared. My first call, precisely 10 minutes later, was to Robert Miller. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "They were here," I said, my voice as steady as the hand holding the phone. It went exactly as we discussed. Peterson was arrogant. David was weak. They left angry. I could hear the rustle of papers on his end. "Good," Robert said, his tone all business. That's the reaction we wanted. Arrogant men make mistakes. Now, the real work begins. I'm filing a petition with the court this afternoon. We're not suing for money, not yet. We're filing for a declaratory judgment. We're asking the court to officially recognize the 2004 transfer of the Whisper Wind Ridge property, not as a sale, but as a non-revocable gift with specific familial intent, and to declare your son's subsequent use of it as collateral for Peterson Capital as a breach of that intent. It was a mouthful, but I understood. We weren't chasing money. We were correcting the record. I'll also be filing a lis pendens on all 80 acres. That's a formal notice attached to the property title, docket number CV202-39017. It means they can't sell it, leverage it, or transfer the title until our claim is settled. It freezes the asset completely. Their 9-figure deal is now on ice. He paused. My retainer for this action is $7.500, Clark. It's a significant fight. I looked at my checkbook on the desk. I'll drop off check number 1482 this afternoon, I said without a second of hesitation. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in quiet, methodical warfare. While Robert handled the legal filings, he gave me a list of tasks. My first stop was the county records office, a place that smelled of old paper and dust. I spent 3 hours scrolling through microfilm archives, the whirring of the machine a hypnotic sound in the stillness. I was looking for the official county tax assessment for the Whisper Wind Ridge plot from 2004. I finally found it, a dry, bureaucratic document that was, to me, a piece of poetry. It listed the total assessed value as of April 15, 2004, at $452,800. I paid the clerk, a kind woman with a magnifying glass hanging around her neck, $12.50 for 5 certified copies. This single document irrefutably established the value of my $1 gift. My next task was to dig through my own financial history. In a metal lockbox under my bed, I found it. My tax return from 2004, and attached to it a copy of IRS Form 709, the United States gift tax return. I had paid a tax preparer $250 to file it properly, declaring a gift of land valued at nearly $500,000 to my son. It was my ace in the hole, undeniable proof of my intent. A week after my visit to the records office, the first official letter from Robert's firm was sent via certified mail to the offices of Peterson Capital, addressed to both Mr. Peterson and David. I had a copy of it on my kitchen table. It was 3 pages of cold, precise legal language. It made no emotional appeals. It simply stated the facts: the date of the transfer, the $1 price, the filed gift tax return, and the 2004 assessed value of $452,800. It then stated our position, that this foundational asset was being improperly used to secure financing for a corporate entity, Peterson Capital, in which I held no stake and derived no benefit, a clear violation of the gift's original spirit. The letter concluded not with a threat, but with a proposal. It offered them 2 options to resolve the matter and lift the lis pendens. Option A: return a parcel of the land equivalent to the inflation-adjusted value of the original gift, which Robert's office calculated at $755,400. Option B: a direct buyout of my foundational stake for that same amount, payable within 30 business days. The response was faster than I expected. It wasn't a letter. It was a phone call 2 days later. I saw David's name flash on the caller ID and let it ring 3 times before answering. "Hello, David," I said calmly. He didn't bother with a greeting. "What is this? What in the hell is this, Dad?" he stammered, his voice a mix of panic and fury. "A lis pendens? A declaratory judgment. Are you trying to destroy me? Peterson is going to kill me. The bank called this morning. They're putting a hold on the financing until this title encumbrance is cleared. I listened to him rant, his words tumbling over each other. He called me ungrateful, selfish, senile. He told me I was ruining the biggest opportunity of his life over some sentimental nonsense. I waited until he ran out of breath. David, I said, my voice perfectly even, this is no longer a personal matter. It is a legal one. Any and all communication should go through my attorney, Robert Miller. His number was on the letterhead. And I hung up. The next communication came a week later. It was a thick, creamy envelope with the embossed letterhead of Thompson, Finch and Associates, a law firm known for its aggressive, take-no-prisoners approach. The letter inside was a symphony of dismissive legal jargon. It called my claim frivolous, without merit, and a transparent attempt to extort funds. It stated that the 2004 transfer was a legal and binding sale, and that the statute of limitations on any claim had long since expired. It was designed to terrify an ordinary person. At the end, in a gesture of what they called good faith, they offered a one-time nuisance value settlement of $10,000 to resolve this unfortunate family misunderstanding in exchange for me dropping all claims and signing a non-disclosure agreement. I read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it on the corner of my workbench. That evening, I didn't call my lawyer. I didn't pace the floors. I went out to my workshop. The air, thick with the scent of cedar and pine, was my antidote to their poisonous words. I switched on the single overhead bulb, and the light fell on the unfinished rocking horse. I picked up a piece of fine grit sandpaper and began to work on the curve of the horse's back. Back and forth, my hand moved in a steady, patient rhythm. The wood grew warmer and smoother under my touch. This was real. The feel of the wood, the purpose in my hands, the quiet dignity of creating something meant to bring joy to a child. Their world was one of threats, of paper and posturing, of numbers that had no soul. My world was here, built on things that last. I wasn't just fighting for a house or for money. I was fighting for this. For the quiet right to sand this piece of wood in peace, in a home I had built, free from the grasp of men who had forgotten the value of anything they couldn't sell. I sanded for 2 hours, until the wood was as smooth as polished stone. Then I went inside, slept soundly, and in the morning I called Robert and told him to reject their offer and proceed to the next step. The quiet carpenter was ready for court. The rejection of their insulting offer didn't bring silence. It brought a different kind of noise. A low, persistent hum of anxiety that seemed to emanate from the city and seep into the quiet of my street. I knew they were scrambling. A 9-figure deal doesn't just sit on ice without consequences. There would be penalties, nervous investors, and a clock ticking with terrifyingly expensive seconds. I didn't have to imagine their panic. I could almost feel it in the air. For a week, there was nothing. No calls, no letters. I spent the time in my workshop, the steady scrape of my tools, a counter-rhythm to their frantic world. I had finished the main body of the rocking horse, and was now meticulously fitting the leather saddle, a piece of scrap from an old armchair of Eleanor's. The familiar scent of aged leather and wood polish was a balm, a reminder of a life built with care, not leverage. Then, one afternoon, the hum became a roar. It started with the crunch of tires on my gravel driveway, a sound too heavy and aggressive for the mailman's truck. I looked out the workshop window and saw a car that didn't belong in my world. It was a long, black German sedan, polished to a mirror shine, looking like a panther that had wandered into a petting zoo. The driver's side door opened, and Mr. Peterson emerged. He was dressed in a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. He stood for a moment, his gaze sweeping over my small, tidy house, his expression a mixture of impatience and distaste, as if he were looking at a stubborn weed in his manicured lawn. David wasn't with him. This wasn't a family visit. This was a corporate raid. I wiped my hands on a rag, laid my leather-working tools down, and walked out to meet him. I didn't invite him in. We stood there in the driveway, between his silent, powerful machine and my quiet, aging home. He didn't offer a handshake. He got straight to it, his voice low and devoid of any warmth. "Clark," he began, as if we were old adversaries, "I'm going to assume your recent actions are the result of some misguided sentimentality and not genuine malice. Let's be clear. You are interfering with a significant business transaction. The delay you've caused is costing my firm approximately $50,000 a day in penalty fees and interest." He said the number as if it were a weapon, designed to shock and awe a man like me. I just stood there, my hands in my pockets, and listened. "This little stunt with the lease pendens," he continued, a dismissive wave of his hand. "It's an amateur move, a nuisance. It won't hold up in court, and you know it. Our lawyers will bury you in motions and fees until you're selling this little house just to pay your legal bills. So I'm here to offer you an off-ramp. A way to walk away from this without completely destroying your relationship with your son and embarrassing yourself." His eyes were like chips of granite, cold and hard. He saw this as a negotiation, a problem to be solved with pressure and money. He didn't understand that he wasn't talking to a business rival, he was talking to a father. "My lawyer has already presented you with two options," I said, my voice even. "The offer stands." A flicker of genuine anger crossed his face. He wasn't used to being stonewalled. "Your lawyer," he scoffed. "A small-town ambulance chaser." "Clark, let's stop playing games. That piece of land was a 20-year-old family transaction. $1. You think any judge is going to unwind a multi-million-dollar corporate structure because of some sob story about a gift? This is the real world. Assets move, capital grows. You can't put a fence around the past." He took a step closer, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial tone. "Look, I get it. You feel left behind. David's done well, and maybe you think he owes you. I'm prepared to be generous. I'll write you a check right now for $100,000, cash. You sign a release, the lis pendens is dropped by morning, and this whole unfortunate episode is forgotten. David never even has to know. You get a nice nest egg, and we all get back to business." It was breathtaking, the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it. He was trying to buy my silence, to buy my dignity, to erase my entire history for a fraction of what they stood to gain. He thought my principles had a price tag. He thought my love for my son could be converted into cash. I looked past him, at my workshop, at the open door where the rocking horse stood waiting. I thought of David as a boy, running through the pines on Whisperwind Ridge, his laughter echoing in the clean mountain air. That was the asset. That was the capital. "That land wasn't an asset, Mr. Peterson," I said, and my voice was quiet, but it cut through his bluster like one of my Japanese chisels through soft pine. "It was the foundation of your son-in-law's entire career, a foundation I gave him. And you don't get to bulldoze a man's foundation and then ask him to hand over the house on top of it." For the first time, he was speechless. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, as if I had suddenly started speaking a language he couldn't comprehend. The transactional certainty in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of confusion. He had no response for this. It wasn't in his playbook. "You should leave now, Mr. Peterson," I said, my gaze unwavering, "and tell your lawyers to expect a response to their letter. We will not be settling." I turned my back on him and his gleaming black car and walked back to my workshop. I didn't look back to see him leave. I just picked up my tools and went back to work on the saddle, the rhythmic tap of my hammer the only sound I needed to hear. The conference room was on the 32nd floor of a glass and steel tower that scraped the sky. It felt like another planet. The air was cold, recycled, and smelled faintly of leather and industrial cleaner. A sterile contrast to the rich, living scent of my workshop. A single, massive slab of dark mahogany served as the table, polished to such a high gloss I could see the distorted reflection of my own tired face in its surface. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled below, a grid of impersonal power and ambition. I sat on one side of the table with my lawyer, Robert Miller. On the other side sat Mr. Peterson, looking carved from granite in his expensive suit, and my son, David, who wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at a spot on the table, his face pale and drawn. Mr. Peterson began, his voice a low, confident purr that was meant to dominate the room. "Mr. Clark, let's dispense with the theatrics. My legal team assures me your claim is baseless. A nuisance suit. We are here, against my better judgment, as a final courtesy to David. We are prepared to reiterate our final offer, $100,000, in exchange for which you will drop this ridiculous leaf pendants and sign a non-disclosure agreement." He slid a pristine white envelope across the table. It stopped a few feet from my hand. I didn't touch it. I just looked at David. He flinched, finally raising his eyes to mine for a fleeting second. They were filled not with defiance, but with a desperate, pleading shame. Robert Miller cleared his throat, a soft sound that nonetheless commanded the room's attention. He opened his own briefcase with a quiet click. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his tone perfectly level, "we are not here to discuss your offer. We are here to present you with the facts you seem to have overlooked." He slid a thin folder across the polished wood, stopping it right next to Peterson's envelope. "Please, open it." With a sigh of theatrical impatience, Peterson flipped open the folder. His eyes scanned the first page. I watched his face. The confident smirk didn't vanish at once. It slowly froze, then began to crumble from the edges. The first document was a certified copy of the county tax assessment from April 15, 2004. It clearly listed the 80 acres on Whisperwind Ridge with an assessed value of $452,800. The second document was a copy of my filed IRS Form 709, the gift tax return, from that same year, declaring a gift to David Clark in that exact amount. Peterson's face, which had been a healthy, commanding tan, was now turning a blotchy, unhealthy pale. He looked at David, a silent, furious question in his eyes. David just sank lower in his chair, looking like a marionette with its strings cut. "As you can see," Robert continued calmly, "this was never a sale. The $1 transaction was a legal formality to bind the contract on what was, by every legal and financial definition, a substantial gift. A gift that formed the entire seed capital for your son-in-law's company, which you later absorbed into Peterson Capital. That gift, Mr. Peterson, is the very foundation of the 9-figure deal you are currently trying to close." Robert paused, letting the weight of the words settle into the cold, quiet room. "The lis pendens will not be lifted, because our claim is not frivolous. It is a claim on the foundational asset of your entire venture." Peterson's composure finally shattered. He slammed his hand flat on the table, the sharp crack echoing in the silent room. "This is absurd. It was 20 years ago. You can't—" "I can," I said. It was the first time I had spoken. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through his anger like a saw through dry wood. Both men turned to look at me. I wasn't looking at Peterson. I was looking directly at my son. "I gave you that land, David. Not as an asset, not as capital. I gave it to you so you could build a life. I never asked for a thing in return. Not for the money, not for the time, not even for a phone call on my birthday." David visibly winced, his eyes shutting tight. "But you didn't just build a life," I continued, my voice steady, holding all the pain of the last few weeks. "You took that foundation, and you let this man build his empire on top of it. And then you both came to my house, a house I built with my own hands, a house where your mother died. And you tried to take that too, all for a business deal. All while trying to placate me with a $10 bottle of whiskey." I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table. The power in the room had shifted completely. It was no longer in the expensive suits or the view from the 32nd floor. It was right here, in the truth. "So here is what is going to happen," I said, my gaze locking with Peterson's. "You have two options. You can fight this in court. My lawyer is confident we will win, and the proceedings will tie up your asset and your 9-figure deal for at least 2 years. Or you can sign the agreement Robert has prepared." Robert slid a final document across the table. "It transfers full, unencumbered ownership of my house back to me, forever. It also establishes a trust, funded by Peterson Capital with a single payment of $755,400, the inflation-adjusted value of my original gift. That money will not go to me. It will be used to fund vocational scholarships for young people who want to learn a trade. People who want to learn how to build things with their own hands." I stood up, my chair making a soft, scraping sound on the floor. You have 24 hours to decide. If I don't have a signed agreement by then, we proceed with the lawsuit." I looked at David one last time. He was slumped in his chair, his face in his hands. He looked small, broken. There was no victory in seeing him like that, only a profound, aching sadness. I had won, but I had also lost a son. I turned, and without another word, Robert and I walked out of the room, leaving the two of them alone in the sterile silence with the wreckage of their greed spread out on the polished table. I walked back into my house and closed the door, the soft click of the latch sounding like the final word in a long, painful conversation. The silence that greeted me was not the heavy, lonely quiet of before. It was a clean, peaceful silence. It was the silence of ownership, of a space that was truly, unshakably mine. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, and for the first time in a long time, the house felt like a sanctuary again, not a fortress under siege. 2 days later, a courier delivered a thick envelope. Inside were the signed documents, cold and official, relinquishing any and all claims to my property and confirming the wire transfer of $755,400 to the newly established Clark and Miller Vocational Fund. There was no note from David. I didn't expect one. I didn't linger on the paperwork. I left it on the kitchen table and walked out the back door, toward my workshop. The familiar scent of cedar, pine, and oil met me like an old friend. Nothing in here had changed, yet everything felt different. I breathed it in, a deep, cleansing breath. It was the smell of my own life, a life I had fought for and won back. My eyes fell on the rocking horse, standing patiently on the workbench. It was so close to being finished, a silent witness to the entire ordeal. For weeks, it had represented a world they couldn't touch. Now, it felt like a monument to my victory. I picked up a small, fine-tipped brush, dipped it in a pot of glossy black paint, and leaned in close. With a hand that was once again steady and sure, I painted the horse's eyes. I gave them a gentle, kind expression, a spark of life. I spent the rest of the afternoon finishing it. I attached the saddle I had crafted from the worn leather of Eleanor's old reading chair, its surface soft with a history of quiet, happy evenings. I carefully attached the tail, made of real horsehair I'd ordered from a specialty shop years ago for a project I never started. As I worked, the rhythmic, familiar motions were a form of meditation. Each turn of a screw, each stroke of the varnish brush was a reaffirmation of who I was. I was not an asset on a balance sheet. I was a man who built things. Things meant to bring joy, things meant to last. When I was done, I stood back. The rocking horse was beautiful, more than just wood and leather and paint. It was a promise I had kept to myself. The next morning, I carried it across the lawn to my neighbor's house. Their little girl, Sarah, saw me coming, and her eyes went wide. When I set it down in front of her, she let out a gasp of pure, unadulterated delight. She ran her tiny hands over the smooth, curved back, touched the leather saddle, and looked up at me with a smile so bright it could have powered the whole city. That smile was worth more than their 9-figure deal. It was real profit, the kind you can feel in your soul. I went back to my house and sat in my armchair by the window, watching her rock back and forth in her yard, a blur of joyful motion. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with a profound sense of peace. The workshop was waiting, full of wood and possibilities. My legacy was secure, not just in the walls of my home, but in a fund that would help a new generation learn the quiet dignity of building something with their own 2 hands. I had won more than a fight. I had reclaimed my life. It's been 6 months now. The Clark and Miller Vocational Fund awarded its first 3 scholarships last week to a young cabinet maker, a welder, and an electrician. I never heard from David again, and I've made my peace with that. Some might call what I did revenge. I don't see it that way. It was a rebalancing. My son and his father-in-law live in a world where everything has a price tag. A house, a company, even a father's love. They saw my quiet life and thought it meant I was weak. They forgot that the strongest things are often the quietest. The foundation of a home, the patience of a craftsman, a man's self-respect. Every morning, from my window, I see little Sarah on the rocking horse, and I'm reminded of what I was truly fighting for. It wasn't just about the money or the land. It was about defending the value of a life built on principle, not profit. The lesson in all of this is simple. Never let anyone, not even your own blood, convince you that your life's work is just a number on their ledger. Your history, your sacrifices, your integrity, that's the real fortune. It's the one thing you own that no one can ever truly buy. If you liked this story, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what you thought. I really want to know your opinion. Here you will always find stories that move, surprise, and bring lessons to take for life.